There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about computers. And when it comes to computers, there are 3 different recipes. But when you have a look at them, they look quite complex. So what I've done is I've laid out all 3 recipes and I've broken it down bit by bit, so you can see exactly what items are needed to make 5 computers per minute. Then, at the end of the video, we'll compare all the raw resources to see what you're saving or potentially missing out on. So let's start with our basic computer recipe, which requires circuit boards, cable, and plastic. So this is the basic computer recipe broken down into the best alternate recipes that I like to personally use, which ends up saving on resources, but might require some other things instead. So, let's start with the plastic. We are going to need 80 plastic per minute. And the best way to make plastic and rubber is with using fuel and then combining one or the other to then make the main resource. For example, for this recipe, we are needing plastic, so we're combining rubber and fuel. To make this 40 rubber, in theory, you could then use 20 plastic and 20 fuel, but for the sake of ease, and so this doesn't go on forever, this is just what I've done, just to try and make things nice and clear. The good news is though, if you do use this recipe, you get 20 heavy oil residue, essentially as a byproduct for free, and you can use this to create other stuff as well. Bear in mind, we're only talking about 5 computers here, so maybe you'll be wanting more computers, which means you get more heavy oil residue. That's essentially how this works. The next recipe is arguably one of the best recipes in Satisfactory, and I will never stop using this. It's called diluted fuel. You basically combine water with heavy oil residue to then create fuel, which is fantastic, and it saves you an absolute ton of crude oil. So if you are looking to save crude oil, then do use this recipe. You will be using more water, which of course means you have to use water extractors, which costs power and its time and its effort, but you do end up saving crude oil. So do bear that in mind in case you do want to do this. You do get 10 polymer resin as a byproduct from the heavy oil residue, but 10 polymer resin will essentially get you nothing. So that's the plastic. Moving on now to the cable, and luckily this is a fairly simple recipe. You don't have to use this trick here. Essentially what I've done is I've combined water and copper ore to form something called pure copper ingots, which means that I save on a bunch of copper. If you have enough copper in your world, you don't have to do this. It means that you don't have to place down the water extractors, and you save on water. But if copper ore is a concern to you, then feel free to use this tactic if you so wish. And in theory, you only then need 16 copper ore to create the 40 cable, which then creates the computer. So essentially it's nothing really, that's just a bunch of nothing. However, what isn't a bunch of nothing is circuit boards, and we are going to be needing 20 of them per minute. In fact, as you can see, every single recipe actually involves circuit boards to make, so this is generally quite an important resource. I've chosen the copper sheet and silica recipe. There are multiple different recipes to create circuit boards, but I think this is the best. In fact, I have got an entire video talking about the phase 3 parts, including circuit boards, plastic, rubber, computers, and heavy modular frames and more, coming out to the channel soon, so hopefully you guys are looking forward to that. Let's just get silica out of the way with. You need 26.4 raw quartz to make the 44 silica, which then makes the circuit boards to make the computers. Talking a bit more about the copper sheets, and as you can see, I am using a lot of alternate recipes in this process because I think they're just better, but I am consuming a lot of water. If you want to do this, if you want to make the 17.6 copper ore into 44 copper sheets, you would have to consume a lot more copper ore. So again, you have to ask yourself, do you want to make water extractors which will consume extra power and probably a lot more time, but it saves you a ton of copper? Or do you just want to keep things nice and simple and just turn your copper ore into copper sheets? Because if you were to use the standard copper sheet recipe, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, which means that the ingots are double what you're making in copper sheets. So rather than consuming 17.6 copper ore, you'll then have to consume 88 copper ore instead. So what do you want to save out on? Copper or water? Up to you. That right there is the basic recipe all nicely laid out. Now let's move on to our Caterium computer alternate recipe, which also requires circuit boards, but also now needs quick wire and rubber. Now, with the Caterium computer recipe, you might realize we are using the exact same amount of circuit boards with the exact same recipe. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this since it's the exact same as what we just talked about earlier. Moving on though to quick wire, and I do actually recommend using this pure Caterium ingot recipe, because I feel like Caterium is quite important, especially in 1.0 to make all that quick wire. So I do recommend doing this, and you are going to need 70 quick wire for your 5 computers, which doesn't sound like much, and to be fair, only consumes 28 Caterium ore per minute, and of course 28 water per minute, so not bad in total. Lastly, we are now making 30 rubber per minute, which is almost 1/3 of the amount of crude oil that we needed for our last recipe. Unfortunately, this does mean that we are making less heavy oil residue as a byproduct, because we're then using less plastic, and we're also making less polymer resin, only 3.75 per minute, which is essentially nothing really. And that again is coming from our diluted fuel recipe, which I definitely recommend. Like only 6 crude oil per minute to make the fuel, which is needed to make the rubber, to make the 5 computers. That's remarkable in my opinion. And I know that I didn't spend too much time talking about this, but that's all I really needed to say. Same recipe there, not that much Caterium over here, and a lot less crude oil as what we were using before. But again, I will compare all these recipes at the end of the video. And lastly, let's talk about crystal computers, which also requires circuit boards, but this time requires crystal oscillators. And here we go, our final recipe, the crystal computers. And yet again, we are using circuit boards, but you might have realized we're using a lot less. This is about 1/3 of the circuit boards we were using in the last 2 recipes, meaning obviously you're using 1/3 of the water, 1/3 of the copper ore, and 1/3 of the raw quartz, which can be rather valuable, so I suppose that's pretty good in that regard, but it unfortunately isn't great when you look at the overall consumption of raw quartz in this recipe. That is because of the crystal oscillator. This thing requires quartz crystals, of which you are going to need 58 raw quartz, which is the most raw quartz consumed in any of these 3 recipes. You're then also going to need some water. This way you actually save on raw quartz. You could use a bunch more quartz if you so wish, but I'd rather save on them personally and use some water. You might not want to do this. Again, this is just a personal recipe for me personally, because it's personal. You then need to make some cable. Yeah, very standard recipe, only a slight amount of copper ore usage, but if you really wanted to, you can consume the 70 copper ore needed to make the 70 copper ingots, but I'd rather save on some. And the final item that you need to make these crystal oscillators is reinforced iron plates. Now you're going to be needing to make 6.25 of these, which requires 37.5 iron plates. To make this, you then need 56.25 iron ingots. If you didn't want to use this water recipe, that would then require you to have 56.25 iron ore, but we're saving on a good amount again, just consuming a bit more water, which is fine really. And with the screws, again, this only requires iron ingots if you use the cast screw recipe, which is one of the best recipes in the game by a landslide. And again, you have to consume a bit of ore. Yeah, it's just iron basically. Reinforced iron plates, if you use this recipe, is just iron. Honestly, not that much of it. So that is all 3 of our computer recipes. But before we go, what I've done is I've condensed them all down into quite a simple format to try and see what consumes the most of what resource. For example, when it comes to crude oil, we've got the basic computer recipe needing about, give or take, 75 crude oil per minute, whereas the Caterium computers only needs 28.5. And of course, the crystal computers requires 0. Now, when it comes to copper ore, we can see that the basic recipe consumes 33.6 per minute. The alternate recipe consumes 17.6, so this cuts down the copper ore consumption by almost half, which is fantastic. And for our final recipe, the crystal computers, this consumes 34.6, which is just about the most out of any of these 3. Now, when it comes to water, the basic recipe consumes 62.8. The alternate Caterium computer recipe consumes 88 per minute, which is more than the basic. However, the crystal computer recipe consumes 95 water per minute, which are the most out of any three. This pattern's also similar with the raw quartz, consuming 68 raw quartz per minute. The Caterium recipe only requires 26.4, and that's the exact same with the basic, since both of these require the exact same amount of circuit boards. Lastly, our two miscellaneous items. We've got 41.1 iron ore consumption in the crystal computers, and we then have 28 Caterium ore being consumed in the Caterium computers. And finally, and rather obviously because this one's consuming more crude oil, we get more heavy oil residue and more polymer resin as byproducts, or free, I suppose you can call them, rather than the Caterium recipe. But the price of this, you are consuming less crude oil, so I suppose in regards to that, this is still kind of better. So what recipe will I be going for? Well, I'll most likely be heading towards the crystal computer recipe, since it doesn't really use that much crude oil, and I'll be turning most of my crude oil into rocket fuel, which I'll then be using for ionized fuel. I honestly don't see much wrong with the basic recipe either. Yes, you have to consume a decent amount of crude oil, but the cable recipe is fairly simple, and the circuit board recipe, again, fairly simple. I suppose it's just a case of, do you want to consume more oil or Caterium? That's like the main sort of question you have to ask yourself for the Caterium or basic recipes. More crude oil for the basic, however the Caterium requires, obviously, Caterium, and that is up to you. That's up to your playstyles, up to what you're kind of consuming. But I hope that laying it out in this format was able to help you come up with an answer. But either way, thank you very much for watching. But before we go, a massive thank you to our members, Mau Mau, Skull and Hattie, Lo, Nitormal, Chaos Rising, Cutthroat Zoo, Yamikel, and Tio Rico.